The water was black and still. Somewhere behind her, the largest ship ever built was sliding into the Atlantic, its stern rising against a sky full of stars. Madeleine Force Astor gripped an oar with bare hands and pulled. She was 18 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. And the richest man in America, the man who had placed her in this lifeboat and promised to meet her in the morning, was already gone. That was April 1912. What followed was not a fairy tale of survival. It was something far more complicated. Over the next 28 years, Madeleine would carry 3 different last names. She would inherit millions and give them away for love. She would marry a childhood friend, then an Italian prizefighter who broke her bones. She would be celebrated, pitied, gossiped about, and finally forgotten, dying alone in a Florida mansion at the age of 46. This is the story of the woman the world called Mrs. Astor, not the famous one, the other one. The teenager who walked into the most powerful family in America, survived the worst maritime disaster in modern history, and spent the rest of her life paying for both. If this is the kind of story you value, take a moment to subscribe. It helps more than you might think. Her name was Madeleine Talmadge Force, and long before she ever set foot on the Titanic, she was already somebody worth knowing. Chapter 1. The Girl from Brooklyn. Madeleine Talmadge Force was born on June 19, 1893, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, ran a shipping and forwarding firm from an office at 78 Front Street in Lower Manhattan. The company, William H. Force and Company, had been established in 1873 and operated in the busy commercial zone near the East River docks. Her mother, Catherine Arvilla Talmadge, came from old Brooklyn stock. Catherine's grandfather, Thomas G. Talmadge, had served as mayor of Brooklyn in the 1840s and oversaw the construction of Brooklyn City Hall. Her father, Tunis V. P. Talmadge, had been a New York State assemblyman. The family was not new money. They were not famous money, but they were settled, connected, and deeply woven into the social fabric of the city. William Force belonged to the kind of men who collected club memberships the way other men collected horses. He was a director of the Staten Island Rapid Transit Railroad and the United States Casualty Company. He sat on the New York Board of Trade and Transportation. He kept an art collection at the family home, first on Remsen Street in Brooklyn Heights, later at a more fashionable address on East 37th Street in Manhattan. The move was deliberate. Brooklyn society was respectable. Manhattan society was powerful. The forces were climbing. They were not, however, anywhere near the top. The Force name did not appear on the guest lists that mattered most in Gilded Age Manhattan. The Forces occupied a respectable middle tier, wealthy enough for private schools and European travel, prominent enough for the better clubs, but several rungs below the dynasties that controlled American social life. That distinction mattered in the New York of the 1890s. It would matter even more when Madeleine's name began appearing alongside one of those dynasties. Madeleine had one sibling, an older sister named Catherine Emmons Force, born in 1891. The two were close in age and inseparable in public. Newspaper columnists would later describe them as the two Graces, a nod to their looks and their easy command of a drawing room. Both were raised Episcopalian, the same denomination as the Astor family, though this was coincidence, not strategy. At least not yet. Madeleine's education followed the path expected of a girl in her position. She attended Miss Ely's school in Greenwich, Connecticut, before transferring to Miss Spence's school on West 48th Street in Manhattan. She stayed 4 years. According to a contemporary account, she was counted an especially brilliant pupil. This was not a casual compliment. It set her apart from the merely decorative debutantes who filled parlours at the turn of the century. Her mother took both daughters abroad on multiple occasions. They toured Europe several times, including an extended stay in Paris, where a correspondent for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle later described young Madeleine as a sweet girl who loved animals, spoke and wrote French fairly well, and had a talent for conversation that made her memorable in any room. Madeleine Force was not raising ornamental daughters. She was raising women who could operate on either side of the Atlantic. Back in New York, Madeleine rode horses with real skill. She sailed. She appeared in amateur theatrical productions staged by society families and, by several accounts, drew attention wherever she went. She was tall, dark-haired, and carried herself with a poise that made people forget she was still a teenager. On December 22nd, 1910, she was formally presented to New York society as a debutante. She was 17. The Junior League, a selective circle of young women from prominent families, brought her in almost immediately. She was seen at the right gatherings, the right charity functions, the right summer retreats, Bar Harbor in Maine, Newport in Rhode Island, the seasonal migration of American wealth that moved like clockwork between city and shore. By the close of that winter, Madeleine Force had everything a young woman of her station could have reasonably expected. Good schools behind her, good connections around her, a name that opened doors without raising eyebrows, no scandal, no controversy, nothing that would have caused a society columnist to write more than a polite paragraph. That would change before the year was out. Chapter 2. The Richest Man in America. The estate was called Ferncliff. It sat on a mile and a half of Hudson River frontage in Rhinebeck, New York, surrounded by farmland and forest. And it was there, on July 13th, 1864, that John Jacob Astor IV entered the world. He was the youngest of 5 children and the only son of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and Caroline Webster Schermerhorn. His 4 older sisters were Emily, Helen, Charlotte, and Caroline. The name he carried was not just a family name, it was a brand. His great-grandfather, the original John Jacob Astor, had arrived from Germany in the 1780s with almost nothing. Through the fur trade, real estate, and a cold instinct for opportunity, the elder Astor had become the wealthiest man in the United States by the time of his death in 1848. The fortune passed down through generations, growing with each transfer. By the time it reached John Jacob IV, the Astor name was synonymous with American money itself. His mother, Caroline, was arguably more famous than his father. As the self-appointed Queen of New York society, she had defined the rules of admission for the Gilded Age elite. Her ballroom at the family mansion on 34th Street could hold exactly 400 guests, and the list of families permitted inside became known simply as the 400. If Caroline Astor did not approve of you, you did not exist in polite society. She was imperious, methodical, and absolute. Her son grew up watching power exercised not through banks or boardrooms, but through guest lists and dinner placements. John Jacob attended St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, then Harvard. After graduating, he spent several years traveling abroad before returning to manage the family's vast real estate holdings in New York. But he was not content to simply collect rents. In 1897, he built the Astoria Hotel on the site of his mother's former mansion, deliberately positioning it next to the Waldorf Hotel, owned by his cousin and rival, William Waldorf Astor. The 2 buildings were eventually joined by a 300-foot corridor known as Peacock Alley, and the combined Waldorf Astoria became the most famous hotel in the country. He later built the St. Regis Hotel, which some considered his finest achievement. He was also, improbably, an inventor and a novelist. He patented a bicycle brake, a device called a vibratory disintegrator that produced gas from peat moss, and a pneumatic road improver. He helped develop an early turbine engine. In 1894, he published a science fiction novel titled A Journey in Other Worlds, set in the year 2000 on the planets Saturn and Jupiter. Critics were not kind, but the book sold, largely because of who had written it. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Astor did not sit it out. He financed an entire artillery battery, donated his personal yacht, the Nourmahal, to the United States Navy, and served as a lieutenant colonel in Cuba. The rank of colonel stuck with him afterward as a social title, and for the rest of his life he was known as Colonel Astor, though the commission had technically been a lower grade. Yachting consumed much of his leisure. He raced boats and offered trophies to the New York Yacht Club. He kept homes at 845th Avenue in Manhattan and at Ferncliff in Rhinebeck, and he maintained Beechwood, the Astor summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. His fortune at the time of his death would be estimated at roughly $87 million, the equivalent of nearly $3 billion in today's money. He was, by most measures, the wealthiest man in America. Those who knew him described a man who was reserved in public, formal in his manners, and difficult to read. He was not gregarious like the Vanderbilts or theatrical like the Goulds. Astor kept his emotions behind a wall of protocol. He rarely gave interviews. He did not seek attention, though attention found him constantly. The newspapers tracked his movements, his investments, and his private life with the relentless appetite that came with covering a man whose name appeared on half the real estate deeds in Manhattan. And by 1910, he was also divorced, restless, and about to make the worst decision of his social life. Chapter 3. The First Mrs. Astor. Before Madeleine, there was Ava. Ava Lowell Willing came from Philadelphia, from a family whose American roots ran deeper than the Astors could ever claim. Her ancestors included Thomas Willing, the first president of the First Bank of the United States, and Edward Shippen, one of the earliest mayors of Philadelphia. The Willings were not merely rich. They were founding stock, the kind of family that did not need to prove anything to anyone. She was born on September 15th, 1868, and by the time she reached her early 20s, she was considered one of the great beauties of her generation. Contemporary accounts called her divinely beautiful. She was tall, poised, and carried the particular confidence of a woman who had never been told no. On February 17th, 1891, she married John Jacob Astor IV at her parents' mansion on South Broad Street in Philadelphia. She was 22. He was 26. It was one of the most prominent society weddings of the decade. The marriage produced 2 children. William Vincent Astor was born in November 1891, just 9 months after the wedding. A daughter, Ava Alice Muriel, followed more than a decade later in July 1902. Between those 2 births, and arguably before the first, the union began to rot. The problem was not money. The Astors had more than anyone could reasonably spend. The problem was temperament. Ava was sharp, social, and restless. She craved attention and gathered it effortlessly in every room she entered. Jack Astor, by contrast, was withdrawn and stiff, a man who preferred his inventions and his yacht to the endless circuit of dinners and receptions that defined upper-class life. Ava found him dull. Worse, she found him embarrassing. According to people who knew them both, she mocked him openly, calling him stupid in front of guests. He endured it. For years, he endured it. By 1896, Ava had established a second life in England. She kept a townhouse on Grosvenor Square in Mayfair, one of London's most exclusive addresses, and a country estate outside the city. She moved through British aristocratic circles with ease, attending events that her husband rarely joined. The Atlantic Ocean became a convenient barrier between them. For long stretches, they lived on different continents, married in name only. Rumours followed her everywhere. London society whispered about her closeness with certain men, though nothing was ever proven publicly. What was clear to everyone was that the Astors' marriage had become a performance, and neither party was interested in maintaining the illusion much longer. In November 1909, Ava filed for divorce. The proceedings moved quickly by the standards of the day. On March 5, 1910, the state of New York decreed in her favor. The settlement was $10 million, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the scale of the Astor fortune and the desire to end things cleanly. Ava retained custody of their 7-year-old daughter, Muriel. Vincent, by then a teenager, stayed with his father. Vincent took the divorce hard. He was 18, old enough to understand the public humiliation, but too young to have any say in the outcome. He resented his mother for her cruelty toward his father, and the resentment would harden over the years into something permanent. He also developed a fierce protectiveness over the Astor name and the Astor fortune, a vigilance that would have consequences for the next woman to enter his father's life. Ava, for her part, moved on. She returned to London permanently, and in 1919 married Thomas Lister, the 4th Baron Ribblesdale, a widowed British peer who had served in the court of King Edward VII. She became Lady Ribblesdale, traded American society for English aristocracy, and never looked back. She outlived nearly everyone involved in this story, dying in New York in 1958 at the age of 89. The divorce freed Jack Astor from a marriage that had made him miserable, but it also marked him. In the New York of 1910, divorce was still deeply controversial, particularly among the Episcopalian establishment that formed the backbone of high society. Many prominent families refused to acknowledge divorced men socially. The clergy viewed remarriage as a moral failing. Astor had escaped one trap only to walk into another. He was 45 years old, one of the wealthiest men alive, and functionally radioactive in the circles that mattered most to his class. It was in that condition, isolated and bruised, that he first noticed a 17-year-old girl at Bar Harbor during the summer of 1910. Chapter 4. The Scandal of the Century. Nobody remembers exactly when Colonel Astor first noticed Madeleine Force. What survives is a newspaper clipping showing that in September 1910, he hosted her entire family at his estate in Bar Harbor, Maine. She was 17. He was 46. His divorce from Ava had been finalized 6 months earlier. Whatever happened that weekend set something in motion that neither of them could take back. Over the months that followed, Astor courted Madeleine in the only way a man of his position could. He took her on automobile rides through the countryside and on trips aboard his yacht. Reporters followed them constantly. Photographers waited outside restaurants. Every meeting was documented, every glance interpreted. By the spring of 1911, the press had already decided what was happening, and the public had already decided what it thought. On August 2nd, 1911, the New York Times made it official. Colonel Astor to wed Madeleine Force, the headline read. She was 18. He was 47. His own son, Vincent, was close in age to the girl his father intended to marry. The reaction was immediate and savage. Newspapers across the country treated the engagement as a moral emergency. The Cincinnati Enquirer described the romance as one of wicked lust. The Washington Times wrote that 18-year-old Madeleine Force has a difficult task ahead. Editorial cartoonists drew Astor as a predatory old man chasing a child. Society columnists who had once covered the Astors with reverence now competed to express the most pointed disgust. It was not just the age gap, it was the divorce. In Episcopalian New York, a divorced man remarrying was still considered a disgrace. Several prominent Episcopal ministers were asked to perform the ceremony. Every one of them refused. Astor's search for a willing clergyman became a story in itself. Days passed without a single minister agreeing. At one point, a former Free Baptist preacher named Edwin S. Strait, who had left the ministry and was working as a carpenter in Providence, was reportedly approached and briefly agreed before being replaced. Rumors circulated that Astor would have to pay thousands of dollars to find anyone willing to officiate. Whether money changed hands was never confirmed. What was confirmed was that on the morning of September 9th, 1911, the Reverend Joseph Lambert, pastor of the Elmwood Temple Congregational Church in Providence, Rhode Island, stood in the white and gold ballroom at Beechwood and married them. It was 9:55 in the morning. Madeleine wore a blue cloth dress with a peach basket hat. Her father, William Force, gave her away. Her sister Catherine served as maid of honor. Vincent Astor, who privately despised the match, stood beside his father as best man. There were no society guests, no elaborate reception. The wedding was conducted in near secrecy, with the details withheld from the press until after it was over. Within minutes of the ceremony, the newlyweds boarded Astor's steam yacht, the Noma, and left Newport. As the boat pulled away from the harbor, its wireless operator received a stream of congratulatory messages. Astor released a statement to the newspapers. "Now that we are happily married," he said, "I do not care how difficult divorce and remarriage laws are made. I sympathize heartily with the most straight-laced people in most of their ideas, but I believe remarriage should be possible once, as marriage is the happiest condition for the individual and the community." It was a confident statement from a man who had spent weeks unable to find a single clergyman willing to bless his union. Whatever relief he felt that morning, it did not last. New York society did not forgive, and it did not forget. When the couple returned from their brief local honeymoon, the doors that had always been open to Colonel Astor remained firmly shut. The solution, as it had been for disgraced aristocrats for centuries, was to leave. Chapter 5: Egypt, Paris, and a Fateful Decision. After the wedding, the Astors did not go far. They sailed west on the Noma to Rhinecliff on the Hudson, near Ferncliff, and then south to Bermuda. It was a quiet start. No transatlantic voyage, no grand European tour. Just a newly married couple waiting for the gossip columns to find a different target. They did not. By November 1911, the press reported that the Astors were planning an extended trip to Egypt. The timing was strategic. Egypt was far enough from New York to put an ocean and a continent between Madeleine and the society that had rejected her. In January 1912, the couple sailed from New York aboard the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's older sister ship, bound for Europe and then onward to the Nile. They travelled with a small entourage that would stay with them for the rest of the journey. Colonel Astor's valet, Victor Robbins, Madeleine's personal maid, Rosalie Bidois, a private nurse, Caroline Louise Andres, hired specifically to attend to Madeleine as the trip progressed, and Kitty, Astor's Airedale Terrier, whom the couple adored and who had nearly been lost during the Egyptian leg of the trip when she went missing for several days before being found. In Egypt, the Astors toured the Nile, visited the pyramids, and moved through Cairo's colonial hotel circuit. It was there that they encountered Margaret Brown, a wealthy Colorado socialite who was recently separated from her own husband. Brown was brash, independent, and entirely unbothered by the scandal surrounding the Astors. She would later become one of the most famous Titanic survivors, known to history as the unsinkable Molly Brown. But in January 1912, she was simply a friendly face in a foreign country, one of the few Americans willing to spend time with the Astors without judgment. Even in Egypt, the Astors could not fully escape their reputation. American tourists recognized them. European papers reprinted the New York coverage. But distance softened the attention. In Cairo and along the Nile, they were simply a rich couple on holiday, not the scandal of the season. For Madeleine, it may have been the most peaceful stretch of her married life. It would certainly be the last. From Egypt, the couple moved to Paris. Astor bought jewelry for Madeleine at Cartier. They attended the theatre. They lived, for a few months, the kind of life that obscene wealth could provide when freed from the constraints of New York opinion. It was during this stretch, likely in late February or early March, that Madeleine realized she was pregnant. The pregnancy changed everything. Madeleine wanted the child born in the United States. There were legal considerations around citizenship and inheritance, and beyond that, a practical desire to be near family and familiar doctors. The honeymoon, which had stretched past 5 months, was suddenly over. The Astors needed to get home. They booked first-class passage on the newest and largest ship in the world. The RMS Titanic was making her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, with a stop in Cherbourg, France. The Astors boarded there on April 10, 1912, stepping from a tender onto the ship that would define the rest of Madeleine's life. Their suite was on sea deck, among the most luxurious accommodations on board. Madeleine was visibly pregnant by now, well into her second trimester, requiring what one contemporary report described as constant care as the couple moved from place to place. She spent most of the crossing in their cabin, occasionally walking the deck with Astor and Kitty. She kept to herself. She was tired, and she was ready to be home. For 4 days, nothing happened. The ship was smooth. The weather was clear. The Atlantic, for once, was calm. That changed on the evening of April 14th. Chapter 6. The night of April 14th. At 11:40 on the night of April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Most passengers felt only a faint tremor. Others slept through it entirely. Colonel Astor did not. He rose, dressed quickly, and left to find Captain Edward Smith. When he returned, Madeleine later recalled, his face was graver than before. The ship had struck ice, he told her, but there was no danger. He helped her into warm clothing and strapped her life jacket over her coat. For the next 2 hours, the Astors moved between the boat deck and the first-class gymnasium, where they sat on the mechanical exercise horses in their life jackets and waited. It was a surreal scene. 2 of the most photographed people in America, perched on stationary horses, bolted to the floor of a sinking ship. Astor was overheard saying they were safer on board than in one of those small boats. But at some point he found a spare life jacket and slit it open with a penknife to show Madeleine what was inside. Cork. He wanted her to know she would float. Madeleine later said he was the calmest person on the deck that night. While they waited, she noticed a woman from 3rd class holding an infant in the cold. Her name was Leah Orks. Her son was called Philly. Madeleine took off her fur shawl and gave it to the woman to wrap around the baby. It was a small act, rarely mentioned in the grand narratives of the disaster, but it says something about who she was at 18. Around 1:45 in the morning, Second Officer Charles Lightoller arrived on A deck to finish loading lifeboat number 4. The boat had been lowered from the boat deck earlier and now hung level with the enclosed promenade windows. Passengers had to climb over a 4-foot railing and through the frames to reach it. Among the families gathered were the Wideners, the Thayers, and the Carters, the wealthiest names on the ship, passing women and children through wooden frames into a swaying lifeboat in the dark. Archibald Gracie, a fellow passenger, later testified to the United States Senate about what happened next. He described lifting Madeleine over the railing. Astor held her left arm as they passed her to Lightoller, who seated her in the boat. Then Astor leaned out over the adjacent window and asked the officer for permission to join his wife. She was in a delicate condition, he explained. Lightoller refused. No men were permitted until all the women had been taken off. Astor did not argue. He asked only for the number of the lifeboat so he could find her afterward. Then he stepped back. What happened next depends on which survivor you believe. Hilda Slater described seeing Astor take out his cigarette case with perfect composure, light a cigarette, and lean against the railing. Some accounts say he tossed his gloves down to Madeleine. The last words she heard him speak, according to multiple witnesses, were a promise that he would meet her in the morning. He did not. Lifeboat 4 pulled away from the hull. The ship went down at 2:20. The bow plunged first. The stern rose into the air, hung there, and followed. 1,500 people died. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, aged 47, was among them. His valet, Victor Robbins, died beside him. Kitty, who had crossed Egypt and France with them, drowned in the ship's kennel. Astor's body was recovered 8 days later by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials sewn into the collar of his blue serge suit. In his pockets, they found a gold watch, diamond cufflinks, a diamond ring, £225 in English notes, and $2,440 in American currency. Body number 124. Madeleine and the other survivors were picked up by the RMS Carpathia around 3:30 in the morning. She was 18. Through her spokesman Nicholas Biddle, she later said only that in the confusion, she thought Colonel Astor had been standing beside her. After that, she had no clear memory of anything until the boats were well clear of the ship. She arrived in New York on April 18th. Vincent Astor, now 20, met her at the pier. He was the head of the family now. Everything that followed, the money, the mansions, the marriages, the slow unraveling, began on that night. And she was about to discover what her dead husband's family really thought of her. Chapter 7. The Golden Cage. Colonel Astor's will had been written before the Titanic sailed. It was not amended during the voyage. There was no final revision, no deathbed codicil scratched out in the hours before the ship went down. What Madeleine inherited was what her husband had decided she should have months earlier, when the idea of his own death was still abstract. The estate was valued at approximately $85 million. In today's currency, that figure approaches $3 billion. Vincent Astor, the colonel's 20-year-old son from his first marriage, received $69 million of it, along with Ferncliff, the family's Hudson River estate, and the yacht Noma. His half-sister, Ava Alice Muriel, received a $10 million trust fund. Between them, the two children of the first marriage absorbed nearly the entire fortune. Madeleine's share was structured differently. She received $100,000 outright, with no conditions. Beyond that, she was granted the annual income from a $5 million trust fund, supplemented by a yearly payment of $500,000. She was given use of the house on Fifth Avenue, at the corner of 65th Street, one of the most valuable residential addresses in Manhattan. She was given use of Beechwood in Newport, all the furnishings in both homes. Her pick of any luxury automobile from the colonel's personal collection. 5 of his prized horses. It sounded lavish. In raw numbers, it was. But every provision beyond the initial $100,000 came with a single clause attached. If Madeleine remarried, she would lose it all. The trust income, the annual payments, both houses, the furnishings, the automobile, the horses. Everything would revert to the Astor estate, which meant, in practice, to Vincent. This was not unusual for the period. Remarriage clauses were common in the wills of wealthy men, particularly in families where inherited property was expected to stay within the bloodline. But the effect on Madeleine was specific and profound. At 18, widowed, pregnant, and grieving, she was handed a fortune that functioned as a leash. She could live like an Astor for the rest of her life, or she could fall in love again and walk away with almost nothing. The will did not care which she chose. It simply ensured that choosing one meant losing the other. The mathematics of the arrangement told their own story. Of an $85 million estate, Madeleine controlled the income from roughly 6%. Vincent controlled the rest. He was 20 years old. He had opposed the match from the day it was announced, had performed his duties at the altar through gritted teeth, and now held the financial architecture of the Astor Empire in his hands. Whatever relationship Madeleine might have expected with her stepson, the will made the power dynamic unmistakable. She lived in his father's house at his sufferance. She spent his father's money under conditions that he, as executor and primary heir, had every incentive to enforce. There was also the matter of the unborn child. The will did not mention Madeleine's baby by name, because the baby had not yet been born when the document was drafted. But it included a provision for any surviving children beyond Vincent and Muriel. That child would receive $3 million, held in trust until the age of 21. It was a generous sum by ordinary standards, but beside Vincent's $69 million, it looked like what it was, an afterthought. A provision for a child the colonel had not expected to leave fatherless. The press reported every detail. Newspapers published the figures, compared them, and drew conclusions. The public understood what the will meant. Madeleine Astor was rich, but she was not free. She was maintained, not endowed. The Astor family had welcomed her into a mansion and then locked the doors from the outside. And the man holding the key was the one person in the family who had never wanted her there. Chapter 8. The Titanic Baby. After the Carpathia docked in New York, Madeleine disappeared. She was taken to the house on Fifth Avenue and placed in what the press called strict retirement. No interviews, no photographs, no public appearances. The curtains at 840 Fifth Avenue stayed drawn, and the most famous young widow in America grieved behind them. Her first social engagement did not come until the end of May, more than 6 weeks after the sinking. She hosted a private luncheon at the house for Captain Arthur Rostron, the commander of the Carpathia, and Dr. Frank McGee, the ship's surgeon. She organized it with Marion Thayer, another Titanic survivor whose husband had also gone down with the ship. Both women had boarded the Titanic with their husbands. Both had left it without them. It was a gesture of gratitude, not a return to society. After the luncheon, Madeleine retreated again. On August 14th, 1912, exactly 4 months after her husband's death, Madeleine gave birth to a son at the Fifth Avenue mansion. She named him John Jacob Astor VI. The newspapers named him something else. They called him the Titanic Baby, and the name stuck. He was front-page news before he could open his eyes. Every detail of the birth was reported, analyzed, and speculated upon. The weight of the Astor name, the shadow of the disaster, and the fortune waiting in trust all converged on a child who had done nothing except arrive. For the next year and a half, Madeleine kept herself and her son out of view. She did not attend parties. She did not appear at the opera or the races or any of the seasonal gatherings where her name would once have drawn a columnist's attention. The press noted her absence and filled the silence with speculation. Was she ill? Was she grieving? Was she planning something? She was doing none of those things, or perhaps all of them at once. She was 20 years old, alone in a house that belonged to her, only as long as she stayed unmarried, raising a child whose inheritance depended on conditions she had not written and could not change. By the end of 1913, the newspapers reported what they treated as an event. They had obtained the first photograph of Madeleine since the Titanic disaster. It had been nearly 20 months. The image itself was unremarkable, but the fact that it existed at all was enough to generate headlines. The public had not forgotten her. After that, she appeared more frequently. Her name returned to the society columns, though always with the qualifier: Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the Titanic widow. She could not escape the association and did not try. In 1915, she remodeled the house on Fifth Avenue. The New York Sun ran a feature on the renovation, treating it as a signal that Madeleine intended to stay, to build a life inside the golden cage rather than abandon it. Articles about young Jakey appeared regularly now. His milestones were public property. His first steps, his early words, his resemblance to his father. The press covered the Titanic baby the way it covered royalty, with an appetite that had nothing to do with the child himself and everything to do with the story he represented. Madeleine settled into a rhythm. Fifth Avenue in winter, Beechwood in summer, her son beside her, her sister Catherine nearby. It was a narrow life for a woman who had once crossed oceans, but it was stable, and after what she had been through, stability may have been enough. She was 22 by the time the world stopped treating her daily movements as news. She had money. She had a healthy child. She had 2 houses full of Astor furniture and Astor silver and Astor ghosts. What she did not have was freedom, and sooner or later, that absence would matter more than everything the will had given her. Chapter 9. Love over Fortune. His name was William Carl Dick. He was 28 years old, a vice president at the Manufacturers Trust Company of New York, a part owner and director of the Brooklyn Times, and the heir to a family fortune built in the sugar refining business. He had grown up in the same Brooklyn circles as Madeleine, attended the same kinds of gatherings, known the same families. They had been children together. Now, in the spring of 1915, they were seen together again at social events in Aiken, South Carolina, and later at Bar Harbor. The press noticed. The press always noticed. By early 1916, Madeleine had made a decision that no amount of Astor money could make easy. She was going to remarry. She understood what it would cost: the trust income, the annual payments, the house on Fifth Avenue, Beechwood, the furnishings, the automobile, the horses. Every conditional provision in her dead husband's will would snap shut the moment she signed a marriage certificate. The total forfeiture, calculated by inheritance tax appraisers and published in the New York Times, came to $3,571,036. She did it anyway. On June 22, 1916, Madeleine married William Carl Dick at St. Saviour's Episcopal Church in Bar Harbor, Maine. The ceremony was held at 2 p.m, officiated by the Reverend A.C. Land, and attended by a small group of relatives and close friends. Her father, Madeleine Force, was present. There were no headlines beforehand. The engagement had been kept secret until 5 days before the wedding. The couple honeymooned in California. It was, by every measure, the opposite of her first wedding. No ballroom, no society columnists fighting for position. No front-page scandals about age gaps or angry clergymen. Just a 23-year-old woman choosing a man she had known since childhood over the fortune that had kept her comfortable and confined for 4 years. The newspapers covered it, of course. They calculated exactly what she had lost. But what she had gained was harder to quantify. She had a husband her own age. She had chosen him freely. And for the first time since April 1912, she was no longer Mrs. Astor. The Dicks settled into a life that, by the standards of Gilded Age widowhood, was almost ordinary. They kept a primary residence in the New York area and spent time at Allen Wyndon Farm, the Dick family estate in Islip on Long Island. Summers took them back to Maine. Their first son, William Force Dick, was born on April 11th, 1917, in Brooklyn. Their second, John Henry Dick, arrived on May 12th, 1919. Madeleine now had 3 boys. Jakey, the Titanic baby, was 5 years old when his first half-brother was born. By most accounts, he grew close to his stepfather and accepted the blended household without difficulty. Dick treated him as his own. William Dick also had a career that extended well beyond banking. He served as a director of Best Foods, the St. Regis Paper Company, and the National Sugar Refining Company. He was a businessman in the traditional mold, connected but not flamboyant, comfortable in boardrooms but absent from gossip columns. For Madeleine, this was precisely the point. After Colonel Astor, after the Titanic, after years of living inside a name that attracted scrutiny the way a lantern attracts moths, she had married a man who gave her something rare. Quiet. For 17 years, the marriage held. The boys grew up on Long Island. Madeleine moved through her 30s with a steadiness that the newspapers found uninteresting and therefore largely ignored. She was no longer the most famous widow in America. She was Mrs. Dick, mother of 3, resident of Long Island. Occasional guest at the sort of gatherings that merited a line in the society pages and nothing more. It was the closest thing to anonymity she had known since she was 17 years old. It did not last. By the early 1930s, the marriage had begun to fracture. The reasons were never made fully public. On July 21st, 1933, Madeleine obtained a divorce in Reno, Nevada. She was 40 years old. She had 3 sons, no Astor Trust Fund, and a name that still made headlines every time she appeared in court. 4 months later, she would make headlines again. Chapter 10. The Boxer. Enzo Fiamonte was born on July 17, 1908, in Casamassima, a small village near Bari in southern Italy. He arrived in the United States as a teenager and turned professional boxer by the age of 17. Over the next decade, he fought 66 bouts as a middleweight, winning 47 of them, 11 by knockout. He was handsome, reckless, and 25 years old when he met Madeleine on a cruise ship sometime in the early 1930s. She was 40. The age gap between them was 15 years, almost exactly half the distance that had separated her from Colonel Astor, but reversed. This time, Madeleine was the older one. The press understood the symmetry immediately and made the most of it. In September 1933, 2 months after her Reno divorce from William Dick, Madeleine slipped on a polished floor in her home in Bermuda and fractured her shoulder. She returned to New York in November and was admitted to Doctors' Hospital on the Upper East Side. It was there, on November 27th, 1933, recovering from her injury and propped up in a hospital bed, that she married Enzo Fiamonte in a civil ceremony. He was 26, she was 40. Her 3 sons were present. Jakey, now 21, had made his feelings known beforehand. When reporters asked whether his mother was really marrying the boxer, he responded with 4 words. Unfortunately, it is true. The couple honeymooned in Palm Beach and eventually settled there. In 1935, they purchased the former Dixie Plantation, a 600-acre estate in Charleston, South Carolina, overlooking the Stono River. Madeleine provided Fiamonte with an allowance of $1,000 a month for suits and entertainment. He drove fast cars. He entered a Maserati in the 1937 Vanderbilt Cup race in Westbury, New York, but was refused entry because he had no formal racing experience. He was a man who lived on the surface of things, drawn to speed and spectacle, and entirely out of his depth in the world Madeleine had occupied since birth. The marriage was described by those who observed it as stormy. There were periods of estrangement followed by reconciliation. Fiamonte taught Madeleine's sons to box, which some members of the family took as an insult, and others accepted as a gesture of good faith. Jakey eventually came around. But whatever peace the household managed to maintain did not hold. On May 2nd, 1938, Madeleine filed for divorce in West Palm Beach, Florida. Fiamonte sailed for Europe before the papers were served. The grounds cited in the complaint were extreme cruelty. No further details were made public. The property settlement was sealed. On June 11th, Judge C.E. Chillingworth granted the decree, and the marriage was over. It had lasted 4 years and 7 months. Madeleine dropped the name Fiamonte and went back to calling herself Mrs. Dick. It was her second divorce, her third last name in 27 years, and the last time she would appear in a courtroom. She was 44 years old. She had no trust fund. She had no Astor mansion. She had a fractured shoulder that had never fully healed, 3 sons in various stages of growing up, and a rented house in Palm Beach where the curtains were beginning to close again. Enzo Fiamonte returned to Italy. He became an actor, appearing in more than 100 films over the next 4 decades. He never spoke publicly about Madeleine. He died in 1993 at the age of 84. Chapter 11. The Last Days of Mrs. Dick. After the divorce from Fiamonte, Madeleine retreated to Palm Beach. She leased an oceanfront property and resumed the name she had carried for 17 years, Mrs. Dick. It was the name that fit the least, belonged to a marriage that no longer existed, and yet it was the one she chose. Not Astor, not Fiamonte, not Force. She picked the name of the man she had given up the Astor fortune for, even though that man had been out of her life for 5 years. She was 45. Her oldest son, Jakey, was 26 and living his own life. William was 21. John Henry was 19. The boys visited but did not stay. The society columnists who had once tracked her every movement had lost interest. One Palm Beach writer observed in the early 30s that one never heard of Madeleine joining any fashionable luncheon or dinner party, and that her social appearances were, for all practical purposes, nil. That observation held through the end of the decade. In August 1939, her mother died. Catherine Arvilla Talmage Force had outlived her husband by more than 20 years and had watched both of her daughters navigate marriages that made national news. She was buried in New York. Madeleine, who had always been close to her mother, now had one fewer person in the world who remembered her before any of it happened. Before Astor. Before the Titanic. Before the names started piling up. 3 months later, in December 1939, Madeleine's Palm Beach home was destroyed by fire. The New York Times reported the loss under the headline, "Mrs. Madeleine Dick loses home by fire." She relocated, but did not rebuild. By this point, her health had been declining for some time. The specifics were never made public, but those who knew her described a woman who had grown thin, reclusive, and reliant on prescription medication. Friends later said they wondered. On March 27, 1940, Madeleine Force Astor Dick Fiamonte died at her home in Palm Beach. She was 46 years old. The official cause of death was heart disease. Some who knew her privately questioned whether she had taken an overdose of sleeping pills. No investigation was conducted. No autopsy was requested. The household confirmed the death, and the newspapers printed the news. The funeral was held at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church on Park Avenue in New York. 1,500 people attended. The press lined the sidewalk outside, noting the arrivals the same way they had once noted the guest lists at Astor functions 30 years earlier. Madeleine would have recognized the spectacle. She had lived inside it since she was 18. She was buried at Trinity Church Cemetery in Upper Manhattan, in a mausoleum she shared with her mother. Not with Colonel Astor, whose body rested elsewhere. Not with William Dick. Not with Enzo Fiamonte. With her mother. The woman who had raised her in Brooklyn, taken her to Paris, dressed her for her debut, and watched from the sidelines as her youngest daughter became the most talked-about woman in America. At the time of her death, Madeleine's estate was valued modestly. The New York Times reported that she left the bulk of it to 2 of her 3 sons. She had entered the Astor family at 18 with nothing but her name. She left the world at 46 with not much more, measured in dollars, but measured in headlines, in column inches, in the sheer weight of public fascination. She had been one of the most scrutinized women of her generation. 3 marriages, 3 divorces, if you count the one that death arranged for her, 3 last names, and a life that had been public property from the moment Colonel Astor first looked in her direction at Bar Harbor 30 years before. Chapter 12. What Became of the Astors? Jakey grew up to look like his father. He had the same long face, the same measured way of holding himself in photographs, and the same instinct for attracting attention without appearing to seek it. He graduated from St. George's School in Middletown, Rhode Island, and then from Harvard, as his father had before him. On his 21st birthday, in August 1933, he came into his $3 million trust fund, which by then had nearly doubled to $5 million. It was, by any ordinary standard, a fortune. But Jakey was not measured by ordinary standards. He was measured against Vincent. Vincent Astor never accepted his half-brother. The contempt that had begun with his father's second marriage deepened over the decades into something more personal. Vincent reportedly questioned whether Jakey was even a biological Astor, a claim that was never substantiated, but that hung over the family like smoke. The 2 men shared a last name, a cemetery plot, and almost nothing else. Jakey married 4 times. His first wife was Ellen Tuck French, whom he wed in 1934. They had a son, William Backhouse Astor III, and divorced within a few years. His second marriage, to Gertrude Gretsch, in 1944, produced a daughter and ended in divorce a decade later. His third marriage, to Dolores Fullman, collapsed almost immediately after the honeymoon. His fourth wife, Sue Sanford, married him in 1956 and stayed until her death in 1985. It was the only one that lasted. Vincent Astor died childless in February 1959. His estate, still vast, passed largely to his third wife, Brooke. Jakey believed he was owed more than what his father's will had provided. He sued, arguing that Vincent had been mentally incompetent when he signed his final will due to years of heavy drinking. Brooke Astor contested every claim. The legal battle attracted the kind of press coverage that had followed the family since the 19th century. It ended with a settlement of $250,000, a fraction of what Jakey had sought and a pittance beside the fortune Vincent had controlled. Jakey accepted the money and said publicly that his half-brother had the legal right to keep it all, but not the moral right. Madeleine's other sons lived quieter lives. William Force Dick, her first child with William Carl Dick, died in 1961 at the age of 44. The cause was not widely reported. John Henry Dick, the youngest, survived them all. He became an ornithologist and artist, spending decades studying birds in a career that bore no resemblance to anything the Astor name had ever been associated with. He died in 1995 at the age of 76. Jakey himself died on June 26, 1992, in Miami Beach. He was 79. His body was brought back to New York and buried at Trinity Church Cemetery, in the same mausoleum where his mother lay beside her own mother. The Titanic baby, the child whose birth had been front-page news 80 years earlier, was laid to rest a few yards from the woman who had carried him off a sinking ship. The gold watch survived longer than any of them. The 14-carat Waltham that had been pulled from Colonel Astor's pocket in the North Atlantic passed first to Vincent, who wore it and then gave it to his godson William Dobbin, the son of his father's executive secretary. The Dobbin family held onto it for decades before selling it to a private collector. On April 27, 2024, the watch was auctioned at Henry Aldridge and Son in Devizes, England. It sold to an American buyer for £1,175,000, roughly $1.5 million. It was, at the time, the highest price ever paid for a piece of Titanic memorabilia. The estimate had been $150,000. A gold watch pulled from the water, a name carried through a century, and a woman buried under 3 of them, who had once been an 18-year-old girl from Brooklyn with good marks and a quick wit before any of this happened to her.